But we are used to seeing words on the screen here in the auditorium. You're used to going into fast food places where they put up the menus on screens. And, of course, they always put that hamburger that looks so delicious on the screen. But when you get it, it never looks exactly the same, right? I bring that up. If you're not familiar with the story in Daniel 5, we are told here about a mysterious message that is written on a wall. But like I said, we are used to seeing words appear up there on the wall, but in that day and age, to see something on the wall, that was quite extraordinary. Now, the manner that it got onto the wall is a little different from how our words get onto the walls here and on screens, but we will see that as we get into it. Last time we were in the book of Daniel, we studied chapter 4, and we looked at a dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had, and Daniel interpreted that dream for him. That dream, if you recall, it was a couple weeks ago now, but led King Nebuchadnezzar to go out and to live like an animal for 7 periods of time, as our text told us, before he was restored to his kingdom, and the chapter ends as he praises God. Now, as we leave chapter number 4 and we go to chapter number 5, we were already given a little bit of a hint on the transition between these two chapters at the end of 4, but I want you to understand that we are now dealing with a new king as we see that King Nebuchadnezzar came to an end there. I already talked about that, and now we come into chapter number 5. When we come to chapter 5, we are dealing with Belshazzar. Now, there are a number of things that happened after Nebuchadnezzar's death, and I won't get into all of it, but if you want to study some of the history there, you can do so. But for example, Nebuchadnezzar's son takes over after he dies and rules for just 2 years, and then he is murdered by his brother-in-law, who then takes over. Now, there's a few other things that happen here, but let me get to Belshazzar. So how does he fit in? Belshazzar is the son of Nabonidus. At this time, when we come to chapter 5, Nabonidus is the king of Babylon. You say, wait a second, you're going to read that Belshazzar is the king. So let me explain here. Our understanding is that he appoints his son Belshazzar to be his co-regent. Many believe that Nabonidus has gone off elsewhere and now leaves Belshazzar to rule there in Babylon. Now, later we are going to see that the person that can interpret the writing on the wall is going to be offered to be the third in the kingdom. Why is that? Well, that's because Belshazzar is number 2 in the kingdom, really, even though he's appointed the king there, and his father Nabonidus is number 1 in the kingdom. So the next position offered is the third. We'll see that later on. The text does refer to Nebuchadnezzar as father to Belshazzar. It's going to say your father. We'll see that. But the understanding of father is that it is in his ancestry. We talk in the New Testament, sometimes it talks about our father Abraham. And they're not talking about that's not Isaac speaking, but it's talking about in his ancestry. So we understand that it's in the line there, but Belshazzar is the son of Nabonidus, and there's a few other things that happened in there, but that's where we get there. So I just want to give you a little bit of that history. You can study that out more. That is not essential to understand the truths here, but gives you a little help. I want to give you one other piece of information, and then we'll jump into verse number 1. We understand that when we read verse number 1, at the very moment that what is happening here in verse 1, the Persian army was besieging the city of Babylon. So as the events unfold that we're going to read here in verse number 1, understand that outside the city at that very moment, the Persian army is there besieging that city. The wall was well secured with massive walls. Inside the city, they had 20 years' worth of supplies. So Belshazzar wasn't too worried about this. He could wait at least a decade before he had to think about it. But that's happening at this very moment. So let's go forward here in this text, and let's begin with Belshazzar's great feast. Belshazzar's great feast. Look with me at verse number 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. Belshazzar has a great feast. Bel is really the beginning of his name is another name for the god Marduk. The feast was a large feast. It was not to worship the true God of heaven, but rather to worship false gods. Archaeologists have excavated there in Babylon, and they have... I didn't do it. They have found a very large hall, which very well could be the place that this took place. In this feast, he commanded that the vessels from the temple be brought to the feast. Now, if you recall, when we were in chapter number 1, I said just take note of this because it will come into play later. But note that the vessels were taken from Jerusalem and brought to Babylon and stored there. And I mentioned we would see them again. Here it is. So why did he go get these vessels? One potential reason was that it was such a large feast and there was a need for many nice vessels for them to drink from. So he thought, I'm running a little low, but I know there's some over there in the temple. Let's just go get those. Perhaps it was in complete defiance of the true God. And certainly I think that is part of it as we see this unfold. As we see, they drank from vessels which had been consecrated for use in the temple, for use in the worship of the true God. But think about this. They are taking these vessels that had been specifically made, specifically designed, consecrated for the priest, the Israelite priest, to use to praise the God of heaven, and instead they are taking these vessels and they are using them to praise false gods. Specifically here, the God of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. And you can just imagine the God of heaven as he looks down and he sees this act of complete defiance with these holy vessels. Thus, here they are praising these gods, fortified within their seemingly impenetrable city, partying away, and something happens. Notice next the writing on the wall. The writing on the wall. In the midst of this blasphemous, drunken, and licentious party, something happens that keeps or gets the king's attention. Now, at this point, I will say this story begins to seem a lot like chapter 2 and chapter 4 because you have a message given to these kings and they can't interpret it, so they need help interpreting. Now, in the last two chapters, it was a dream. In this case, it is writing that appears on a wall. Think about this. The king is there. He very much thinks, I am in control. Here we are worshiping these false gods. We are partying. We are having a great time. when something completely out of his control takes place. Something he can't do anything about. As Pastor Matt read us in reading earlier, this had such an impact on him that he was unable to remain standing. He turned pale, his legs gave way, his knees knocked together, as the text says. And I would imagine at this point, those around him came to his aid and grabbed him as he is about to fall to the ground. What he was seeing was part of a hand, fingers, writing a message on a wall. Now, again, you are very used to seeing words up on a wall. That is nothing. But if we take ourselves out of that context and all of a sudden, somewhere on a wall here, a message just wrote with fingers, even today that would still be a little eerie. The king doesn't know what the message means. It's just like chapter 2 and 4. The king doesn't know. So what does he do? He calls for his wise men, just like Nebuchadnezzar did, right? Call for the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, have them come in, and they can tell me the interpretation. Except they can't. The king offers them gifts. He offers them, as Pastor Matt read, to be third in the kingdom. Again, behind he and his father, but third in the kingdom. But they are unable to interpret this writing on the wall. And so this just leads the king to further anxiety, further fear, as he has no answer. However, in verse number 10, we read that the queen had an idea. It says that she came back to the hall, but it's interesting to note because in verse number 3, it says that they were already there in the hall. Likely, the queen referred to in verse number 10 is not the king's wife, but his mother, or even potentially his grandmother. Because she had had some experience with kings needing interpretation of dreams. She knew where to find somebody that could answer them. So she explains, "O king, there is a man in your kingdom that can answer your question, what is this writing all about?" As a matter of fact, she gives him high praise. High praise. There is something different about this man. As a matter of fact, she even goes so far as to say, your father, again a reference to his ancestry, made him the master over all of the wise men. And his name is Daniel. Therefore, call him. Well, the king, of course, wants an answer. So let's waste no time. Let's call for this man. Let's call for Daniel. We read earlier up through verse number 12, so let's pick up in verse number 13 now, here in chapter number 5. Then was Daniel brought before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and an excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make it known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. What we have just read essentially rehashes everything that had already been said in the text. It's now being told to Daniel. Daniel is now informed of the situation. And what we learn in this book, and we will see next week, and I'm excited to get to chapter 6 with you next week. Daniel in the Lion's Den. Kids will enjoy that together. Adults will too. And you can read it if you want. Daniel in the Lion's Den next week. But what we learn in this book is that this is a godly man. I don't know about you, but to think of being in Daniel's shoes right now is really terrifying for me. There's these letters on the wall, and you need to interpret the dream. Maybe more terrifying with Nebuchadnezzar, who said he would tear everybody in pieces back in chapter number 2 if you can't give us the interpretation. But this is a tough place to be. But I believe that Daniel had a confidence in God because he had already been here and he knew that God could give him the interpretation. So let's turn our attention to the interpretation. Look with me now at verse number 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O thou king, the most high, God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, and majesty, and glory, and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Who he would, he slew, and whom he would, he kept alive, and whom he would, he set up, and whom he would, he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was disposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will." Notice Daniel is not in this for the money. He's not in this for the fame. As a matter of fact, he says, you keep that, give it to somebody else. I don't want that, but I will give you the interpretation. And then notice what he does. Students, notice what he does here. He gives the king a history lesson. History teachers will like this, right? It's good to have a history lesson. Because if we don't know history, we may very well repeat the very same mistakes that were made before. As a matter of fact, though, this was not from very distant history. Daniel was not reaching back into the recesses of hundreds and thousands of years ago. He was just going back a little while and saying, here's a lesson that was not far at all. And if you were here when we studied chapter 4, you should be familiar with this, and I mentioned it at the beginning as well, because God had given Nebuchadnezzar this amazing kingdom. However, he got puffed up with pride, and so God humbled him and made him like an animal. And he dwelt in the fields, eating grass like an oxen. But eventually the message got through to Nebuchadnezzar, because he did praise the God of heaven, as we saw at the end of chapter 4. Notice now verse 22, because I think this is key to this chapter. "And thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this." Belshazzar, you knew. This wasn't some deep history lesson that was just vague and way back in the recesses of the archives. No, you knew all of this. We could maybe give him a little bit of a pass if he was unaware of all of this that happened thousands of years ago. But this had just happened. As a matter of fact, the queen, as we referenced here, likely had seen all of this, perhaps even relayed these messages to Belshazzar. But despite knowing it, you did not humble yourself. By the way, this is a struggle that many have today too. No, not because you're king, but there are many people that know what they are doing is wrong. They know that they shouldn't be doing those things. They know they should be doing something different, but they fail to do so. I have had many tell me, as I have talked with them about sinful actions that have been in their lives, and I've had many people tell me, I always knew what I was doing was wrong. Never questioned that. I always knew it was wrong. But they were not doers of the word. They were unable to follow through. By the way, Belshazzar did not learn from the previous mistakes of Nebuchadnezzar, his father, his ancestor. 2 weeks ago, I mentioned that I was told I hadn't made enough mistakes. You may recall that. My dad told me that. I got a text from my dad later that day, and he told me he was making some more mistakes so he could teach me some more. And my wife commented on it also, and I do want you to understand that the mistakes were made. I believe it was a discussion about a plumbing problem that I was having with a shower, and that was the context of that discussion, okay? So you know. By the way, through my dad's advice, the shower is fixed and we're good, okay? So don't worry about that. Tie up all the loose ends of that story. But it's true that sometimes we don't learn from other mistakes. Verse number 23. But hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Despite your knowledge of how Nebuchadnezzar was humbled, despite the fact that you knew Nebuchadnezzar praised the God of heaven, you have taken the vessels that are used for praising him and instead used them in worship of a false god, false gods. The God that gave you breath, you are not glorifying. Continue on in verse 24. Then was part of the hand sent from him, and this is the writing was written. And this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written, many, many tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing, many. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel. Thou art weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. I entitled this message for today, Numbered, because of the first word there, many, and it's used twice, many, many, M-E-N-E, and it's used twice to give emphasis here. God's patience with the king who had not humbled himself, had gone only so far, and now it was over. Now God would punish this man who had taken the vessels that with the express purpose of worshiping the true God had instead used them in a blasphemous way. And God said, many, meaning numbered, your days are numbered. Your days are coming to an end. And by the way, we'll see this in a moment, but both his kingdom and his life is in view here. Tekel. Tekel means weighed in the balances. In that day, you may have heard that they would at times use a scale, and they would put an object on the scale, and then they would use a weight, and they would put that weight on there, and the scale should balance out, meaning that it was proper. But if they had altered the item in some way, and then, or something had happened to that item, and they'd fixed it incorrectly, then the scale would show that it's not right. And God said, Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances. Belshazzar had been weighed and come back wanting. His moral and spiritual character were found wanting, greatly lacking. Upharsin. The letter U is akin to our English word and, really. So he's saying and parson. Now, if you notice in verse 28, it uses the word Perez. Well, Perez is just singular for the word up there in verse number 25, upharsin. So it's a singular word, and that means divided. Your kingdom is now to be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Verse 29, then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Despite Daniel saying, you don't need to do that, I don't need the awards, I don't need the fame, I don't need to be given this position, he was made the third in the kingdom. And that brings us to the final two verses, verses 30 and 31, and we see Belshazzar's end. Verse 30, in that night, get that? That night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So let's put it all together. At the beginning, do you remember I noted for you that at this very moment the city was surrounded? They thought the walls were impenetrable. They had 20 years of supply. They had water. They had everything they thought they needed, and they were untouchable. Inside, they are partying, a blasphemous party. They thought that they were untouchable, but there is still a God on the throne. And that very night, Belshazzar was killed, and his kingdom, his rulership came to an end. One explanation of this from history is that the army outside was busy digging a trench around the city because there was water that came in one end and out the other end of the city, and they were busy digging a trench. And they finished that trench and diverted the water around the city, allowing them then to enter in underneath the gate into the city. Those inside the city believed it so secure they weren't even guarding it. They entered in, and the king was killed. This also fulfills the prophecy from the first dream. If you remember back in chapter number 2, Daniel would interpret it. I'll just change over to this. That they would, the person that was the statue, the head of gold, and then the chest and arms of silver would be the Medes and Persians, if you recall that. And so it fulfilled that prophecy. And then we find out, and we'll speak of him next week in chapter 6, that Darius becomes the king. Let me give you a couple of lessons here as we conclude this today. Do you know someday your time will be up? If you have never trusted in Christ, could I encourage you that now is the time? If you have never believed the gospel and placed your faith in Jesus Christ, the one, as we celebrated in communion, that died for your sins, shedding his blood, was buried in a tomb, and rose again, don't wait, because the time is now to come in faith to Jesus Christ. But for those of you who know, like Belshazzar, you know and perhaps have even seen in your own family what is right. Understand that God is a gracious and merciful Savior, but someday his patience will end and judgment will come, just as it did with Belshazzar. Can I remind you of a verse in Proverbs 6:15? Therefore shall his calamity come suddenly, suddenly shall he be broken without remedy. This verse speaks of a fool, a wicked person. Don't be that fool that says, I'm just going to put it off. Don't be that one that says, oh, later I'll get my life right with the Lord. Now is the time. For Belshazzar, the writing on the wall came, and that night his life was taken from him. As we look at this text, perhaps we could see a parallel with this and the rich young ruler as we find in Luke. Let me just read that verse for you. Luke 12:20. But God said unto him, Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? The rich young ruler thought, I have it all. I've got it made. Thou fool. Could I also remind you that even in the midst of sinful activity, as we saw here in this text, there was drunkenness, there was worship of false gods, there was blasphemous worship using the vessels from the temple. Although not spelled out, I believe there was also great immoral activity associated with this party. Despite all of that, God was still in charge. And he got the attention of the king. I said it earlier, but just may I remind you that God is still on the throne today? Perhaps we have just witnessed that fact in our country. I'm not going to get too far into this, but despite a president in a particular party that is holy, mostly at least, for the killing of innocent babies in the womb, a recent ruling has struck down the federal law of the land for abortion. Now, you can explain it many different ways, but the simple fact, how it happened from a human perspective, is that the previous president had the opportunity to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. He did